Welcome. My guests today are Corey Everton, the head of Bluestone Analytics at CACI, and Jim Schrant, the director of strategy and growth, also at CACI. Corey, Jim, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion today. When it comes to open source intelligence, most experts believe the intelligence community remains in the early stages of embracing it as a discipline. OSINT, as it's called, is generally defined as unclassified information, often publicly or commercially available, like social media feeds or cell phone data. The use of open source isn't new, but intelligence officials have been working for more than a year to standardize OSINT efforts. Former officials last year established a new OSINT foundation to advocate for a greater focus on OSINT, including professionalization and training. But for analysts to gain really a full picture of what's going on across all sectors, across all areas of the world, agencies need to consider going into the dark web, and that's where we're going to start our discussion. Corey, jump in here. The dark web, it sounds scary. It's dark, it's webby. What is it? Why should people know and understand it when we talk about open source intelligence?
Yeah, the dark web is a very important piece of the open source intelligent puzzle. The dark web is just the part of the internet that's not visible to search engines and not accessible using your standard browser technology. It requires the use of specialized technology to access that part of the internet. In reality, it's also not a nefarious place just by default. It was actually funded with a majority of funding by the US government and designed as a safe space for individuals to be able to access outside communication, to access outside information without fear of censorship. In reality, just like any other technology, it has many nefarious purposes. What we see is that a number of threat actors take advantage of the anonymity that the environment provides to use it for illicit activities.
Corey, when you talk about a specialized technology, I got to download another search engine. What do you mean by special technology? I think people who maybe have never, and I have to be one of them, I've never visited the dark web. What do I need to do to visit it? Or maybe I don't want to.
I think that's a great point. I think it depends on which type of dark net you're talking about. There's actually more than one technology that is out there. Tor is the most common dark net. And for Tor, it is as easy as downloading another browser. You can even put it on your cell phone, your mobile device. So Tor, very easily accessible. Some of the other dark nets like I2P, Freenet, ZeroNet, those are going to require additional configurations to properly set up and remain anonymous.
I appreciate that. I think a lot of us have heard about Tor. And I think that was I think I had yelled at my kids one day for stop downloading stuff from Tor or something, but that's a whole different discussion, right? Let's talk a little bit about why this is gaining kind of interest in why should agencies understand that that is an option for open source. I know, Jim, do you want to jump in a little bit?
So one of the big problems with the dark web, it's the anonymous nature naturally allows the threat actors to utilize that anonymity to conduct a number of nefarious activities that really are a challenge to national security and specifically the interests of the US government. Those range from Chinese companies being able to market and ultimately conduct business of fentanyl precursors and the elements needed to produce fentanyl to Mexican cartels and then ultimately back to US citizens, to child exploitation and human trafficking that occurs over the dark web, all the way to rogue states and rogue threat actors being able to communicate, post messages, post hacked and leaked data across the dark web. So it really becomes a significant threat, both to national security, the interests of the US government, and to everyday citizens with all of that cumulative threat activity occurring on the dark web.
The threat piece is people, I think about, well, maybe I'm not allowed to use the dark web. Maybe I shouldn't get into it. Is at the same time, the benefits, as Corey talked about, is it was created by the US federal government to help kind of communicate, to help have a place where maybe censorship can't happen. Is that why there's a misunderstanding because people only hear the negative side of it?
So from the US government point of view, what we want to be able to help enable the US government to do is get onto the dark web to really accomplish agency mission and agency mission objectives that would be better facilitated through the dark web. So some of the barriers to the US government is the technology and being able to access it, having the appropriate level of training, understanding to once you're on it, to be able to operate effectively. And then whether it be to derive intelligence for intelligence objectives, derive evidence for law enforcement objectives, understanding how to synthesize that entire workflow and process to really achieve those governmental objectives that ultimately help lead to national security.
I think you hit upon a couple of points that we should hit upon: barriers, technology, appropriate training, obviously the workforce, understanding how to synthesize, because I'm sure it's one of those things like anything on the web, the overload of data. How do you take it all in? How do you understand what's important? So let's maybe start with the technology. Corey mentioned this idea of maybe having to download a specific browser or do some other things. Is it also the technology is, hey, maybe that's not allowed on government machines? Is that also a big issue? Like, oh, I can't access that. I can't even get to ESPN because they don't want me watching sports during the day. I don't know, Corey, you want to jump in here on the tech side?
Yeah, this is a really important consideration as well. There's a lot of risk associated with accessing these different dark nets. As you can imagine, there's often a lot of malware on the websites or the leaked data that you might want to download. And so bringing that onto a government system would pose an enormous risk. And that sort of exposure is what we would like to minimize. However, there's a huge learning curve that can be greatly shortened by using technology designed to make sure that you have a safe and secure way to access these environments without exposing your hardware, your agency, your individual IP address. And that's where we can step in and help shorten that learning curve to help give you that information advantage.
So one of the problems that the US government is facing, and as you had mentioned earlier, Jason, as the US government is trying to both reorganize itself and look at policy and process improvements, particularly through OSINT. Dark web's very much part of what that OSINT space looks like. And through information advantage, which for us, we define as really the ability to collect, synthesize, and unified open source information into a cohesive package of information to help the government make better decisions, ultimately to drive mission and objectives. There's a lot of barriers to entry, and especially in something as technologically sophisticated and intimidating as a darknet, from both a policy standpoint and from just a technical access standpoint. So what we want to help government achieve, both through our expertise, guidance, and the technology enablement component, is the ability to get on safely. Because as Corey mentioned, the risk is considerable because you're really going on to a highly sophisticated, decentralized, but diverse technical environment that is the darknet. So you've got a lot of threat actors that really know what they're doing. So we want to be able to provide those government agencies with the ability to get on there, but do it in a safe and anonymous manner, and help do it within the policy confines that particular agency, through its authorities, is able to operate. So part of what we're able to do with helping these agencies accomplish information advantage is help work through and achieve those technical goals and those policy goals to really enable those very clear outcomes.
You mentioned policy goals. There's a side to that, which is the legal and regulatory issues. Want to get there in just a second, but I want to go back to the technical piece. Are a lot of times when you talk about the moving to the dark web, you're in a environment that is not connected to anything else? The cloud makes the easy sense, but even the cloud's connected to other clouds. It's we don't know how it works by now. Or are you in a, you have one machine that is going to the dark web, and that's all that machine does. So there's no worry about hopping or leaking or the cyber, all the cyber things. Is that kind of how it works, generally speaking? Corey, you want to jump in?
I would say not necessarily.
Okay.
Using the Tor browser, for instance, you can actually access open web websites as well. It's not just going to restrict you to what are called onion sites. Those are the dark web Tor sites. Some of the other nets don't allow you that same flexibility, but it can all happen in the same on the same computer, just within different browsers. And that is where your risk of exposure can come from. What you can do, though, is use things like virtual machines or misattribution platforms that allow you to reduce the risk, reduce your exposure, reduce that surface area of what is touching the dark net or those pieces of the internet that you may not want to leak your information to, or vice versa, have information come back from those systems that are then potentially compromising your systems.
So what we're able to do through CACI tools, specifically Dark Blue and Dark Pursuit, is imagine the Google of the dark web, if you would. So we're able to allow a government agency to safely get on and assess both what's on the dark web and what has been on the dark web historically in very much sort of a Google search type capability, but all completely in a safe environment that protects that government user and that government agency's identity. Through Dark Pursuit, we're able to really enable that government agency and user to get on and actually be an active member inside the dark web. So we're able to really enable two very specific capabilities in a very safe and policy compliant manner.
Let's jump over to the legal regulatory side. I'm sure somebody's going, okay, great. I can use Tor, I can use some of these other tools, but can I actually use them? And Jim, why don't you start with what are some of those regulatory legal issues agencies need to keep in mind?
So every agency is doing their own legal assessment in terms of what that looks like, both between commercially available information, publicly available information, and the Director of National Intelligence is really leading to help make it more accessible for government agencies because it's such a critical data point, which is open source. Because as we see encryption start to increase both across society and specifically across threat actors, the ability to harness and utilize this open source data ultimately to help that agency achieve an information advantage is absolutely necessary. So we're seeing a lot of policy advancements, but speaking towards specifically the dark web it's completely legal to access and engage on. What those levels of engagements are, which range anywhere from mere observation and conducting a Google search of the dark web and what is happening on the dark web, to more direct engagements, those sort of vary from agency to agency. But part of what we're able to do through CACI is work with that agency to help enable whatever those required tools are that are requisite with those agency authorities.
When you talk about the policy that ODNI is helping, maybe just touch upon that a little bit if you can. Is it just hey, we put out a policy document that says it's okay, or are they doing more? Is it around kind of the training, the education of this is what it is and this is why it's important?
So most importantly, it's to really identify for the agencies why open source exploitation is essential to achieving mission success. And you bring up a great point, Jason, which is that success is really going to be driven through a couple key components. First is obviously the technical ability to go on and do OSINT investigations or utilize OSINT information to help drive those objectives. Secondly is on very specific technologies such as the dark web, the ability to have the proper tools to be able to access to conduct what that government mission is on those specific technologies is important. Once again, just having technology without an understanding of how to utilize it is not enough. So that training component becomes a critical step to make sure that those government investigators, those government analysts are able to understand not only how to drive the technologies, but what the left and right limits are so that they can operate safely for their own purposes, for the agency's purposes, and then for mission success, really be able to do everything in a very unified and sound manner. So part of this policy unification, and then for us at CACI, the ability to unify those capabilities, those authorities, and that training into one bundled package to achieve information advantage is critical to government success.
Jim, you mentioned a bunch of the key components. We're going to get into that in the next segment. First, we're going to take a quick break and we'll come back. You're listening to the discussion Exploiting the Dark Web to Gain Information Advantage, sponsored by CACI on Federal News Network.